Welcome to the National Academies workshop on verifiable COVID-19 credentials. I'm Larry Gostin from Georgetown University, and I'll be moderating our first session. Our first session is going to explore the law because there are many technical aspects to verifiable COVID-19 credentials, ethical and other social issues. But there are also legal issues, both legal issues in the United States and in other sovereign governments, as well as under international law. And so we're going to explore these legal concerns today, including the ability of governments and others to regulate travel in the United States, interstate travel, but more importantly, international travel through sovereign borders. And this is also going to include privacy concerns and to what extent individuals have the right to withhold that kind of information, or whether verifiable proof of vaccination systems pass muster when it comes to privacy laws in the United States, the European Union, and in other parts of the globe. Note that the other two sessions today are going to be focusing on ethical considerations, and after all, we do want our proof of vaccination systems to be both lawful and ethical. And then we'll turn to business and economic issues and the effect on the economy and productivity of these kinds of systems. For you, the audience, the public, you can submit questions to me or any of the speakers anytime during the workshop via the text box below the video player. And you may need to decrease your video viewer so not to be in full screen in order to see that chat function. I will then see your questions in chat and pose them on your behalf to our speakers. And I'm extraordinarily privileged, as is the Academies, for this panel, which has three very, very distinguished speakers. I'm going to introduce all three speakers now, and then just call on them to save some time. And I won't go through their entire bio because they're all so distinguished that we would run out of time. Meryl Chertoff is the executive director of SalPal and an adjunct professor of law at Georgetown Law. She's one of my colleagues. From 2009 to 19, she served as the executive director of the Aspen Institute's Justice and Society program. And among her notable work at Aspen was the direction of seminars for judges, lawyers, and state officials, and the creation of the Inclusive America Project, and the direction of the Sandra Day O'Connor conversation. Glenn Cohn is another close friend of mine. He's one of the world's leading experts, if not the leading expert, on the intersection of bioethics and the law, as well as health law. He's a remarkable scholar, humanist, and from Tokyo to Krakow to Vancouver, Professor Cohen has spoken at legal, medical, and in industry conferences around the world, and his works appeared in all of the major news media. I think it's really noteworthy. He was the youngest professor on the faculty at Harvard Law School. And when he joined the faculty at age 29, I knew him then, and I begged Glenn to come to Georgetown, but we missed him. And then the third speaker is Jean McHale. Jean is a professor of healthcare law and the director of the Center for Health Law and Science and Policy at the University of Birmingham. I lived in the UK for 15 years, and Jean and I became very close friends, and we wrote a whole lot together. She's an author and editor of several books, including in the area of European Union health law, European health law themes and obligations. She's got a huge academic profile, and she's also worked with the UK House of Commons Health and Social Care Select Committee and the House of Lords European Union Select Committee. She's one of the leading scholars in the United Kingdom. So with that, I'm going to first call on Meryl to begin today's conversation.
Thank you so much, Larry. I'm very privileged to be with this group. Larry mentioned SALPAL. SALPAL is the Georgetown Project on State and Local Government Policy and Law. I brought a few slides along today, if we can go to the first substantive one. Slide, okay. So this is the state of play with respect to international travel as of this week, and I cannot tell you that if I checked this morning, I would tell you that it's going to be the same state today as it was as of 6/24/2021. We are in a situation where we have a real patchwork of restrictions, and I think if there are two things that you should take away from my presentation this morning is that we are far from a vaccination passport regime in the United States, and we have a significant issue with respect to who is in charge, and who is in charge really matters. So if you take a look at this first slide, you'll see that the US essentially has a protectionist approach. We are not relying on vaccination, but we're relying on testing. So that a person can be brewing and you get a snapshot when they board a flight, they can go someplace else and they can become infectious after they land. So if our purpose is to protect others as well as our own citizens, the situation that we've got right now is not going to work. In addition, if we look at, next slide, please. If we look at the international air travel inbound, we see that we've got a non-reciprocal regime whereby presidential proclamation, people can't come into the US. Air travel is suspended into the US by non-US citizens and permanent residents who in the last 14 days have been in one of 33 listed nations. And those include, per requirements put in by the Biden administration and not by the Trump administration, Schengen countries, the UK and Ireland and Brazil and South Africa. So as to all of those, travel by non-US citizen or green card holders is currently suspended. And I provided for details, you can go to the State Department website. So just a quick observation as to who is not included in those restrictions. You can travel from the US to Mexico, not over a land border, but by air, without any testing and without vaccination. You can travel to Greece without any testing or vaccination, versus the situation in Canada and in Germany, where Americans will soon be able to, as of August 9th, travel to Canada with proof of vaccination. So what we have essentially set up is a COVID colonialism system where countries that really need the tourism and need the money are being forced to open their borders to US citizens, Europeans, and others, but countries that are better situated financially are able to exclude. So US, Germany, and things like that are able to exclude. countries that really need the money are opening their border. So the question of international travel regulation, historically, the US government has control over travel, international travel. And you all have probably yellow fever international travel cards. So this situation is not like yellow fever. There isn't a single inoculation. There isn't a single accepted form of vaccination. There isn't lifetime immunity. There isn't a reciprocal regime. And finally, we've got the question of federalism issues. That is, if you enter the United States, you may enter through a federal facility, but pretty soon you're in a state. And so that it brings into play federalism issues. So let's just go over very briefly what's going on at our borders. So land borders are closed for now. They're going to be the hardest to regulate once they reopen, but at least there's a single authority, Customs and Border Patrol, and Customs and Border Patrol coordinates with the CDC and will carry out CDC recommendations. By air, the CDC is relying on private airlines, both US airlines and foreign airlines that have agreements, reciprocal agreements, to carry out CDC recommendations. So we are actually relying on private actors. At the airports, we rely on the TSA and the FAA, and they can create their own regulations. And finally, the US has a history of withholding passports. During the Red Scare, there was a low-level employee who would refuse to issue passports to people who wanted to leave the United States who were affiliated with the Communist Party. So there is a history of the State Department being able to regulate entry and exit into the United States. But as soon as you get out of that TSA envelope, you are within the province of the state government. And as we have seen in prior pandemics, state governments having those police powers and having public health authorities are able to take their own actions. So some of you may remember the case during the Ebola epidemic in 2016, when people from the US were going in to do medical aid missions, and they were coming back, and there was a case of a nurse named Casey Hickox who was allowed in through TSA, but then was picked up in New Jersey and placed under quarantine by the governor of New Jersey, transported back to Maine, where she was quarantined by the governor of Maine, sued everybody in sight. But there were state quarantines that were separate from the federal quarantines. And so the question of that coordinate jurisdiction does create the question, who's in charge? And this really is brought to a point in the current situation in the cruise industry. So the CDC, during the course of the pandemic, put into place conditional sailing orders, which basically restricted the cruise lines from operating and set a series of gates that they had to meet, including 95% vaccination rates for people boarding, requirements as to people on the staff, masking requirements, all very good and well. But then the state of Florida brought a lawsuit, and in state against Becerra, the question was whether the CDC had the authorities to make these requirements. And unfortunately, when the governor of Florida sued in district court in Tampa, the district court sided with the governor against the CDC, saying that the CDC lacked the powers to require vaccinations and to impose anti-masking rules. The case went to the 11th Circuit, and the 11th Circuit initially reversed the district court and then re-reversed itself to side with the governor. So the state of play right now is that the cruise industry cannot impose masking rules and cannot impose vaccine requirements. And what we are seeing internally in the US is a vast disparity in the requirements that are being imposed. So governors in Texas and Florida, for example, are using their powers in order to prevent local governments from imposing mask requirements and vaccination requirements. And the cases so far, fortunately, seem to be siding with vaccination. Two cases that you should be aware of. One was a case out of Indiana, Indiana University, requiring the vaccination of its students. The district court and now the Seventh Circuit in the Clayson case sided in favor of the vaccination requirement, and additionally, interesting, said that the emergency use authorization provision, which is currently what the vaccines are under, did not create a private right of action. So that's very important. Also in Bridge against Houston Methodist Hospital, and that was a requirement for vaccination of hospital workers. Again, the court has sided with vaccination mandates. Now, why am I talking about state cases when we are dealing with a question about international travel? It's because each regime is only as strong as its weakest link. So within the United States, if we have weak links in some of the states and we have extensive transmission, and if state governments can cause a race to the bottom, that's going to be a problem in terms of international travel. The same thing is true in the Schengen. The Schengen is only as strong as its weakest link. So if Spain has a very high rate, it's going to be problematic to create some sort of a vaccination regime in the Schengen. The question, I think, at the end of the day that we have to look at now is, what are the CDC powers? Who controls? Do the governors control? Does the CDC control? And I would argue that one of the things that we need to do before we even get close to a vaccination passport regime is to review the Public Health Services Act 42, Section 70 and Section 71, what its powers are. And I would leave you with a question: if we today did not have a Biden administration and had a populist nativist president, what would international travel look like? Could we return to that? And with that, I'll turn it back to Larry.